And welcome back to the Pleasant Street Podcast with Taylor Nissi. Taylor, it's good to see you again. And you're going to talk about a topic today that I've heard discussed on other podcasts, but not in the same context. Always sort of like as people should try. And you've got a guy who not only should try, did try, and helps others try. And with that mystical, strange, twisted intro, I'm going to hand this podcast over to you so you can explain to people what's going on here, buddy.
Thanks, Bill. Great to see you as always. So, yeah, today's guest is someone who I think will resonate a lot with a lot of our audience. Dan Bubniak is a certified EOS implementer based in Connecticut who's made it his mission to help entrepreneurs build better businesses and better lives through the Entrepreneur Operating System, EOS. But what makes Dan's story really compelling, as Bill just alluded to, is that he's not just a coach. He's lived it. Dan started his entrepreneurial journey at 24 years old, stepped into a small family business in the Northeast as COO and CFO and a co-owner. In over 6 years, he helped bootstrap the business from a small regional operation to a national organization with over 250 employees across multiple states, with 20x growth. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't happen without vision, accountability, and a serious commitment to building the right systems. So we're really excited to talk to Dan about that, talk about EOS, talk about what he does now. And we're really excited to get this conversation started. And one other thing too, Dan is a board member of the Entrepreneurs Organization, EO, that we're both members of here in Connecticut. And he's a sought after speaker who isn't afraid to tell it like it is, and whose clients will tell you he genuinely cares about their success. So with that, Dan, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
Awesome. I'm excited to be here. That's a great intro. I appreciate the kind words.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the best place to start, because our audience is a lot of business owners, founders, entrepreneurs, let's start talking about what it's like to jump into a family business at 24 years old and kind of talk us through that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I spent the first 4 years in the corporate side of things, got my CPA out of school, went to Deloitte Tax, worked in Stamford, Connecticut, but mostly in New York City, actually, on some big private equity clients. So I got kind of my chops working 100 hours a week, kind of across the board on tax projects. And so I think what I learned there was discipline, but I didn't learn much about actual scrappiness and running a business until a friend of mine, that I grew up with, his dad started a business in Connecticut. And, they would ask me questions from time to time. They're really people, culture oriented, not so much financially minded. And so that's where I came in to kind of help them see, where they could take this business. And that's when I jumped over the fence. They offered me a job to come in, be their CFO, gave me an equity stake in the organization. And what I realized when I walked in the door was that I had this idealistic image of what a business actually was, that there's a bunch of people that know what they're doing and it's really buttoned up and they're smart. And when I walked in the door, it was, oh my God, this is Scotch tape. And we're about to miss payroll. We're about to go bankrupt. I have no idea how any of this stuff works. And so what I realized was business was actually pretty simple. That, all we're trying to do there is create some sort of service or product offering that what it costs us to produce that offering, we could charge a little bit more. And it really struck me that that is all business is. And so when I went in to try to solve the problem of, getting us back to profitability, focusing on how we grow the business, it all stemmed from, okay, we have this cost basis. How can we charge a little bit more? Right? Where is the market for that? So that's where we started. And I think what I also realized in a family business with 5 other owners who were family members is it is easy to, what's the word I want to use? It's easy to kind of operate in a democracy in a family business because, sometimes people feel entitled with the same last name that they should have a seat at the table. But not having clarity on who the decision makers are and owners of functions makes for really messy operations. Lots of slowness, lots of kind of emotions and egos. The family that I operated in, I still love to this day. We still talk. No one was intending to be egotistical or to slow the business down, but just, that's how family businesses operate, right? Everybody wants to say. it wasn't until we reorganized the business, and that was something I saw early on, was if we're going to scale this thing because we have a product offering that works and people want it, we have to find a way to add structure and make decisions faster and have people in seats who could really own things. And so we went through the process of reorganizing that business, and from there it was kind of a rocket ship. Once we got people in the seats, family members in the right seats, we got, the son became the president, I became the person running the kind of day to day, we that's when we broke out and started really
Mhm.
growing exponentially. So yeah, that was kind of the early days, and I guess what I learned.
Yeah. And so that was interesting because I knew it was a family business, but I didn't realize it was a close family friend of yours. So you were sort of in the family, but to your point, right? You didn't have the last name. You weren't there for a long time. So I would imagine that created quite a bit of tension when you're coming in there, kind of making recommendations, and maybe some people are feeling a little bit cut out. As someone who runs a family business, it certainly is complicated. I can totally agree with that.
It is
Um,
complicated. Yeah, it is. But I think if
yes.
you can find common ground and you get a common interest about what everybody wants, and we focus on that rather than, the individual,
Hmm.
that made it a little more simple to kind of get people to understand why we needed to make some of the changes we needed to make.
Yeah. And kind of keeping the main thing always the main thing, not worrying
Yeah.
about egos and, oh, well, what's my new title? Things like that. It doesn't matter as much if you have that clear vision of what the future, will be or you want it to be.
Yeah.
So, when you think about that type of growth, right? 20x growth over 6 years, you know, what were like the one or two things that made that possible? And if anything, what slowed it down, or what were kind of the obstacles you had to overcome?
Yeah, so we're a service business, so a merchandising business. The simplest way to think about it is you put a person in a grocery store, and the brands on the shelf pay us to represent their products. And so ultimately, the first answer to that question is getting a financial model that works. And so I know if it costs me $8 to put somebody in a grocery store for the 10 minutes they're going to service that brand, I've got to make $10 back from that brand. And so I found a way early on to really ensure that I had a price point that was profitable, and I knew I could get a return on investment in people. So that was number one. So from day one, we always knew exactly what the price would be and what it would cost. A lot of companies that I coach now, they almost overcomplicate that, and they don't have clarity. For me, it's like you have to know what your margins are so that you can then go push that product and sell that product correctly. So we knew that was step one. The second component was having a service that people want, and that sounds obvious, but we found product market fit very early on. So even before I got into the company, the father son, they had enough brands out there that were paying them where they said, okay, we really have something here that people want, and it was geographically constrained. So we were doing it in the Northeast, and we had a good thesis that, okay, if these brands want to pay us in the Northeast, they probably want to pay somebody in Los Angeles too. And they
Hmm.
probably want to pay somebody in Florida too. And so then the question becomes, well, if we have a financial model that works here in the Northeast, and we know we have demand for this product kind of across the country, well, then the third component is risk tolerance, which is, and that was where I think I really brought to the family this vision that if we were going to scale this thing, we would have to recycle the profits because we didn't want to raise money. That was another kind of core
Hmm.
value of the family was, we were really culturally sound around treating people with respect, getting people, the right people in the organization. And we felt like if we brought a third party in, it would mess with that.
Yeah.
So we said, we kind of took the stand from early on that we're going to take all of the profit from each location that we had and recycle it into growing into new locations. Because we were able to make money every time we put people into stores, we had margin to kind of recycle into the business. So, we would go from New York City into Los Angeles, and it was kind of doing some customer research, talking to the customers we had. Hey, if we had a team out in LA, would you like this? Would you pay for it? Right. And really starting to understand that allowed us to take those calculated risks. But what I would say, and I see this in a lot of clients that I coach, it's, I think fast growth comes from um, heavy investment, which sounds obvious, but everyone's afraid to do that. Like everybody's like, I can't hire these people because I don't have the money to do it. Whereas the way that we looked at it, and I especially looked at it, was if I'm making 200K a month or 100K a month, in the early days, it was way less, like let's say 20K a month profit. I have 20K a month to put into people. So I can go hire 3 or 4 people in LA and be break even on that, right? If I can go sell a couple of customers. So we really simplified to napkin math. What would it cost us to be in these locations? How many customers would we have to sell? And then we made the investment and then we sold the shit out of it, to be frank.
Mm-hmm.
Like we did it and then we tried to go sell it. And our intuition was right in the early days that we could stand these teams up, sell them, recycle the cash, and really not worry about in the early days were we stuffing our pockets with money. We weren't worried about that. All we were worried about was, are we not losing money in the short term, and are we growing? And then once we got to scale, then we could start, having profits really come in and have a treasury. So that was the approach.
Yeah, and you said something there that I wanted to kind of double click on, right? To really grow takes money, and obviously you're talking about the merchandising business, going into grocery stores, but you work with a lot of clients in a lot of different businesses. So, do you agree that to grow means invest? Well, to have the ability to really grow means investing in your people and building the team, or are there groups that you work with where growth is increasing digital ad sales and things like that? How do you think about the tie-in of growth to people? And I'm honestly asking this as a selfish question because I'm in the middle of I'm growing, exponentially, but we have a people problem. We need more people to scale our growth. So I'm curious, when you think about growth, is there always a component of people, or do you find other people doing it different ways depending on their business?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're a products company, it's
Hmm.
not always people,
Yep.
right? Because product companies tend to be lean and their investment tends to be on the sales marketing side. But in a service-based company, which are probably most of my clients, it's almost always people, at least what I
Hmm.
see. And it's funny because a lot of the CEOs and leadership teams I work with, there's hesitance to hire people, especially in more senior capacity, because it goes into we can't afford it, right? Or it's going to erode our margins. And one of the frames I try to bring them back to, and it's simple, and it's not intended to be patronizing, but sometimes could feel like it, is when you think of the term return on investment.
Hmm.
It's return on investment. Like you
Yeah,
have to
you have
invest
to spend.
money
Yeah.
and you get a return on it, right? And
Hmm.
so the calculus for a CEO is, if I put somebody in that seat, can I make more money on them than they cost me? And in almost every circumstance in a service company, the answer is yes, right? Like if
Hmm.
I am struggling in sales or if I'm struggling in operations, let's say, and because I'm struggling in operations, me, the CEO, I'm dealing with the brunt of those problems and I'm more engaged in that function. Well, then I'm spending less time out in the market selling. And the
Hmm.
CEO is like the grand slam hitter. And so that's costing them a shit ton of money. Actually, like
Hmm.
not hiring that person, not spending the $200,000 a year on that hire is probably costing them $1 million a year. But they don't see it that way often. They'll see it as a $200,000 expense. So for me, it's trying to get that owner to understand and look at it. What is the return on invest? Not what's the cost. If I place that seat, how many hours do I get back? And if I have
Hmm.
those hours, if I have 500 hours a year, how much am I going to sell to the market? That's how I look at it, Taylor. And so that's kind of where the conversation goes. And I think the other side, that I often try to push on people is we tend to overblow risk all the time. And this was a kind of a secret at Dirty Hands, the company I scaled, was, the risk of a bad hire. And let's say it's a senior one, $200,000,
Hmm.
right? So on a monthly basis, that burns maybe 15, 16K a month. We look at that as a heavy risk when it's the opposite. The worst that can happen is you hire somebody, they don't work out. Okay, maybe we lost $45,000 because 3 months we paid their payroll, but the upside of getting the right hire, especially in a senior capacity, I spend $200,000, I make $5 million because now
Yeah.
I'm selling in the market, or that person is really performing and bringing in new clients, or optimizing a process, or reducing. And so there's really not a ton of risk, especially when you think about investing in people. The worst case, you lose a little bit of money. The best case, you probably 5 or 10x the investment on that person. And so that's how I try to get people to understand that, what's the actual risk there. Because in
Yeah.
my experience, the risk is probably not hiring.
Yeah.
That's
The
the real
risk is
risk.
continuing to muddle along and struggle, and you're missing out every month, every year, every day. You're missing out on those opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's pivot a little bit and talk about EOS. So you're obviously an EOS implementer. We're kind of dancing around what different frameworks are, but for listeners who aren't familiar with EOS, and maybe this is the first time they're hearing it, can you give us the plain English version of what it is and what problem it solves for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so EOS is essentially a common way to operate the organization, get people crystal clear on where the company is going to go, right? We document a vision that includes things like a 10-year plan, a 3-year plan, a 1-year plan, really what is the company focused on from a product perspective? What's the target market? Usually kind of the first problem that leadership teams have, especially as they go from 1 to 3 million, and then they start growing into the 20, 50, $100 million ranges. Everybody sitting around that table is operating with friction. They all have a vision in their head, but it's not the same. And so, the way I like to explain it is if you're rowing a ship and everybody's actually rowing in the same direction, but people's oars are tilted a couple degrees each, there's so much friction in that ship. And so that's kind of what a leadership team faces if they're not clear. And so step one in EOS is getting clear on where that company is going, how it's going to get there. So we've reduced that friction. The second thing is then creating a culture of accountability and discipline. So we put in place some tools to allow that leadership team to really create an accountable and disciplined environment. Those are things like creating scoreboards with KPIs on them. So leadership team operates with 5 to 15 metrics, right? It allows them to be proactive, to solve problems before they blow up into big issues. We also then create a cadence of, setting priorities against that vision. So every leader in the room, every 90 days, we come back, we look at where we're going and what are the top 3 to 7 priorities for the business. That creates that discipline around focus, getting clarity, what's important. And then each leader actually has to report on those things every single week after we develop a meeting pulse. So really like what EOS is creating kind of a common operating framework where we're creating clarity where we're going, and then have tools so that everybody has the same standards in how we move, the same meeting pulses, the same, goal setting cadence, the same metrics cadence, and we push that throughout an organization. So that's ultimately kind of what EOS is, just a common way to run a business.
Mm-hmm.
I guess,
And
Taylor, if I was going to dig in on this, like a good way to explain this is, and I've seen this, I've personally dealt with this too in my business. If you don't have a common way of doing things, what you're seeing is leaders have different way of doing things. When I was running my business and I had a couple of functions reporting to me, I would run with metrics and priorities, and we would kind of set on that cadence. And when I had maybe a peer who would run a team and they didn't do that, there was different standards. And then my teams are like looking over the fence of like, why are we operating this way and that team's not? And it creates like turf wars where
mm-hmm.
really if you're running a business, you want to have the same set of standards of how people move and operate, meeting pulses, metrics. And so EOS we're dropping that common framework into a business.
Yeah. And did you implement EOS into Dirty Hands, or was that something you kind of learned and discovered after Dirty Hands?
So when I was running Dirty Hands, when I started in the early days, I had no direct reports, ran a finance function by myself, ran operations as well, but really didn't have any kind of direct reports. But as the organization scaled, started getting the 50, started getting to 100 employees, I had no experience managing people, especially even at Deloitte before. I wasn't a manager at that point when I left. I felt super lost in terms of how do I actually make sure people are high performing. And so I read a bunch of different books, cobbled all that stuff together, tried different kind of methodologies. There's other ones like OKRs, and scaling up is Rockefeller habits.
Mm-hmm.
And then I happened onto Traction, this book, and I was like, oh my God, this is super simple. I love it. And so that was kind of the framework I started to bring into the organization and operate my teams under. So I didn't use a coach to do it. I regret that. I didn't even know coaches could do it. And it's funny when you try to bring in a new set of standards into a business, everybody's used to the old version of you. And they're like, why don't we just go back to the old way you're doing it? Or they don't believe you that you're actually going to use these tools that you say you're going to use. And so there was a lot of friction in getting that system in place because people were skeptical. Is this just another thing we're going to use? Right. Whereas,
Mm-hmm.
when I think about it, if I had a coach come in and really help us push it, it would happen much faster. So that's what I love about doing it from this side today. It's like these things are up to speed very quickly with tons of buy-in, and you see kind of relief immediately.
Yeah. The EOS system parallels a lot of what we do with our clients. We call it the strategic wealth operating system, a nod to EOS, but it's very similar, where we start with the vision, whether it's an individual or a husband and wife or a business. We make sure we're clear on the vision, and then we have a certain operating cadence that we make sure we're checking all the pillars of wealth throughout the course of the year and updating and adapting over time. And for us, it's so interesting to see, when we first meet folks, it's kind of like what you're talking about with the business. It's a little disorganized. One spouse might think one thing's going on. The other spouse, who's usually a business owner, has a totally different perspective of things. So getting that shared vision is the first sort of aha moment. And then going through our process in that first year, really, again, with the tools we're implementing, each meeting, it's coming more and more simple. And then year 2, year 3, it's a really straightforward process. Now, when you take EOS and drop it into a business, how quickly are you seeing that type of a shift? How quickly are you seeing things, the tension, the friction you talked about with the rowing the boat? How quickly are you seeing that sort of dissipate?
My initial instinct. So I'll start with immediately is the answer. I mean, in the first 3 days in our process, they're in 3 months and they're full days with the leadership team. And in those 3 days, we're putting in place a clear vision. We're debating it, documenting it, getting it to paper. And so a team feels really clear within 3 months. And then they have tools now. So we get a meeting pulse, the scorecards, metrics, all of it. So immediately they get better, like instantly,
Hmm.
which is cool to see, because by the end of that third session, people are like, "Oh my God, how are we not doing this?" Right? Um, but it's funny because the word friction, I think, is the wrong word, because a business should always be in friction. Because if you're growing, you're going to run into difficult problems, right? We're going to
Hmm.
run into, the person in sales that's running it is stuck. They're not producing enough leads for the business, right? Even with EOS, the best operating framework in the world, you're still running into these problems. A product offering, I'd had this at Dirty Hands when we, try to invest in a new product offering and it's a flop, right? That's
Hmm.
going to happen. So as businesses grow, even through EOS, there's still tons of friction. What the framework allows you to do is really understand at the root, what is the friction, what's causing it. Is it a people problem? Is it a process problem? Because now we have these tools to really help us diagnose where, usually companies, when they get stuck, they're kind of beating around the bush on the issue. They're not really diving into what the core is, and they'll kind of stay plateaued for longer. So I would say, like, just getting a set of tools into a business, they're immediately seeing relief and operating much better. But ultimately, you still want friction. It's just we want to make sure we're catching that friction earlier and solving it earlier, which is my job as the coach, right? So when
Hmm.
we're running into points where we can see our metrics on a scorecard is telling us we have a problem in sales, my job as the coach is to say, let's call it out. Where's it coming from, right? Is it a people issue, right? We look at the
Hmm.
director in sales and have that conversation. Is it the target market isn't clear, right? So let's go look at our vision. Let's get clear there. Really, EOS kind of allows us to diagnose those issues and get to them deeper. So
Yeah.
yes, they get better immediately, but we're still dealing with tough issues throughout the process.
Yeah. Yeah. And another question, kind of thinking about the entrepreneurs you're working with, right? As they move through your process and they're getting to year 2, year 3, how many of these entrepreneurs do you think start to get a cleaner sense of what they're doing personally because of how organized the business has become? Do you think there's, you know, any sort of tie-in or, transitive property, for lack of a better term, like, oh wow, this is how the business is running, let me apply some of this to my personal life? Or do
Yeah,
you?
I see it all the time. Actually, it's funny. I'll have kind of CEOs will tell me like, "Hey, I brought this into my house. We're running a meeting pulse," and the wife, or husband will get frustrated with that. Like, why are you treating this like a corporate meeting, right? But
Yeah.
I think like what I love and what I try to coach my clients on is, yes, we're using EOS tools, but like, what is the first principle of the tool? And when you think about it that way, everything becomes easy to apply in other kind of boundaries outside of your business. So, yes, we need a clear understanding of where we want to move into the future. We have a tool for that called the Vision Traction Organizer, but I could go home and say, talk to my wife about, hey, what do we want for our future? What are the core components of that? And we can get clear on that, right? And then the second thing is, well, how do we make that actually happen? In EOS, we have a meeting pulse that has quarterly priorities and we have metrics. I could go into my house and talk to my wife and say, hey, what do we want to do this quarter? Right? If we really think about what do we want in the grand scheme, what do we want to do this quarter? So the first principles of these tools are applicable anywhere. It's really getting people to understand not just what the tool is, but how do you apply it and when do you pull it out? And then I'll see people take it into their personal lives often.
Yeah, very cool. And so, what do your scorecards look like for your kids? No, just kidding. Just kidding.
They're too
Um,
little for those, but
yeah,
yeah, we
exactly.
someday they'll have one.
Yeah, they drew 5 pictures today and napped for 2 hours.
Yeah, how many temper tantrums did you have? No
Yeah.
doubt.
So when we think about these principles, right, you can apply them to very complex organizations with many, many people. You can apply them to running a household. Is there a business, if you're a solo entrepreneur who's listening to this, um, is EOS right for them? If you have 5 employees, where do you sort of draw the line of who should be thinking about these principles and who, if anybody, might not want to spend time on this because it might not help them?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody, if you're trying to run a business, everyone should think about these principles because, I run my business on EOS and I have, a partner in crime who works with me, one person, right? And we run
Hmm.
on EOS every quarter. We meet and we talk about what are the priorities for this organization this quarter and let's get clear on them, right? Because if we're unclear on them, they're just going to drift.
Yeah.
What are our metrics, right? We're looking at how many prospects do we have in our funnel every week, right? We're looking at how many, client sessions, operations, we have over the next year, and we're making sure we're on track. I think it's like what I like to say is there's human psychology that kind of moves against what you want. And it's if I wake up and I open my computer, there's 1,000 things I could do that day. And so if I'm not clear about what I want, there's going to be drift and I'm going to just answer emails and that's going to refill up and I'm going to go a quarter and say, oh my God, I worked 50, 60 hours a week, but I did nothing. Right.
Hmm.
Even as one person, right. That's going to happen. The second thing is like that human nature is we're geared to do the easy things first, right? We always push the hard things off. That's just what happens, right? That is why you open your laptop and answer emails first. So what I love about EOS, even from just one person perspective, is if I get clear about my priorities and I put them to paper, I slap them on a wall, I look at them every single week. I have a meeting pulse with myself where I look at them and I schedule my week out. Those disciplines are super helpful in combating like doing 1,000 things or doing easy things first, because now I have a methodology to hold myself accountable. So I tell anybody, like, you should get comfortable with the tools, read the book Traction, learn them. What I will say is to actually pay a coach like me, I'm expensive, right?
Hmm.
Coaches are expensive. And so it's hard for companies that I would say with less than 5 employees to justify bringing an outsider in,
Yep.
because they need to make investments in getting people on the boat, right, and delegating. So we like to say in EOS, it's like usually once you get to about 2 million or 10 people is when it would, from a return on investment perspective, make sense to use a coach. But I think the concepts are applicable to anybody that's trying to do something at a high level. I would recommend looking into the tools.
Hmm. Yeah. And I guess this leads to another question. So, if someone's listening and says, I want to do this, what's the first step? Is it reading Traction? Is it listening to a podcast? Is it calling a coach? How would you recommend someone takes that first step if they're listening to this and want to explore it?
Yeah, I mean, I would call a coach. EOS has a directory, and you could find a coach local, and they'll talk to you for free, right? And
Hmm.
you can get a sense of kind of what the process is. What I do with people that call me is I just get really curious about their business, and I get into the weeds and understand their problems, and I'll tell them, I'm like, you know what, this isn't your solution, right? But maybe go talk to this person, or I'll say, you know what, my intuition that is that your problem is X, and here's how I would think about solving it, or here's how a client would solve it. So I think, like, the cool thing about EOS and is there's a global network of coaches where if somebody's hearing something like this and they just want to learn or even get some free advice, just call one up. Everybody's happy to talk to people. I love it,
Yeah.
quite frank. Like I love talking to business owners about their problems. It's fun.
Mhm. Yes. Same. Yeah. And what's the, what's a transformation that you've seen through your work at EOS or with EOS within a client that's really stuck with you? Like, is there one system that's really makes a change for a lot of people? Or is there one, kind of client story that you can sanitize a little bit so there's no personal information, but some big transformation that you've seen through the work with EOS and the framework that it provides?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I work with 25 teams today, and I almost rarely see a transformation not happen, like a pretty substantial transformation. The only time you'll see it is if somebody doesn't commit to doing the work. I mean, EOS is like going to the gym with a trainer, right? Like you have to show up to the gym and you got to do
Hmm.
the work. Most people that go on the journey, they do the work because that's why they're paying me, right? So they're invested. Um, I would say if I was going to pull one out, one that comes to mind, I'll pull two out. One that comes to mind is, a business that maybe they were 3 or 4 million when they started. They'd been plateaued there for 10, 15 years. Small family business. When I talked to the owner, the conversation we said was like he felt like he could not go on vacation. Like he literally could not take one day off because he was the person answering the calls when there was a customer issue. He was the person doing the work. It's an engineering firm, so they're doing the work. He's the person mopping the floors, right? He's literally doing everything. And so when we talked about his leadership team in that kind of discovery call, I said, "Who's the people that you could trust to really own things?" And he said, "No one. There's not one person on my team that I feel comfortable could run a function." And so, we started the process, and 2 years later, he has an entire leadership team. He's grown the business 40%, where it'd been plateaued for 15 years. He's taking 2-week vacations often, and he's spending time doing like CEO things, like being in the market, right? Solving some big engineering problems where he's got a team really executing the day to day. He got a finance leader in, he got a sales leader in, he's got a couple operations leaders in running the engineering teams. And so, he every time I see him, he's like, I cannot believe there was no world where I saw this future was possible,
Hmm.
because he was so ingrained in solving every single problem himself. That's one. Another one would be maybe at a larger scale, would be a firm that kind of came in financial services and pretty big, in the 20-30 million revenue range, where they'd come in, they had kind of a legacy leadership team, some new leadership, new CEO, really wanted to grow the business, but had lots of like old dogs. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Like
Hmm.
old guard, didn't want to change their change how they were operating, and he could not see a path to doing this in a way that he could start to make changes without imploding the business. And so we went through the process, and a year later, leadership team's completely brand new. Almost every seat on the bus has changed, and they've doubled in 1 year. And this is a large organization. So, when I talked to that CEO, he says, I knew what I was trying to do. I just didn't know how to translate it to other people and get the right pieces on the board. And the framework kind of allowed me to have a path to do that with clarity and confidence. And so
Hmm.
those are kind of two examples. And again, in my experience, like business owners are smart. They wouldn't have a profitable organization at the scale they have when I start working with them if they weren't smart. They know what to do. They sometimes get caught in this rut where they're doing things the way they've done them, and they almost need permission that you can change it and a way to change it. And so that's what I love is like that first day. I'm like, if you were going to rebuild this thing from scratch, what would it look like? And then it like
Hmm.
breaks their mind and they're like, oh my God, I could do that if I wanted to. And now there's a path to start reinventing this thing. So and then that second day, that third day, they start to be much more confident that, oh, I can do this and reinvent again. So those are two examples that kind of stick out.
Yeah. And I think the common language is so important, right? It gives them permission to make some of these big statements without feeling like they're reinventing everything. And I also, in my experience working with a similar audience, right, is often what got you here won't get you there, right? The things, you being the one that solves all the problems, being the key point of every relationship, being, tied up in operations, that's going to work till you hit a certain threshold, and then to really elevate, you've got to delegate. So I've seen that so many times as well.
Yep.
Well, I really appreciate the time here, Dan. It's been wonderful kind of sharing your story, talking about your experiences, and sharing it with our audience. So we'll wrap up with a little bit lighthearted question. What's a piece of content that you've consumed recently that you've enjoyed or would recommend? Book, podcast, anything?
Yeah, no, I really like the Founders podcast. David Senra runs that podcast. He's got another podcast called, I think, David Senra Show or something, but it's ultimately stories of founders, from history, and then he's interviewing some great founders today. So they're real stories with actionable information. My thing is, like, what I love is there's for what you're trying to achieve, there's been 1,000 people who have done it in the past. So why stumble over the same issues when you could learn from people who have done it? And that those two podcasts are really case studies on founders who've done it. So I love that. I highly recommend it to other people who are in it. And I listen to it probably every day.
Awesome.
That is a great conversation. Thank you, Dan, for coming on and talking about change. Hard thing for organizations to actually do. It's funny because I've been in managerial positions during the course of my career, and one of the hardest things, and I'm curious about your perspective on this, is recognizing that you need to change. I guess the people who reach out to you have some sense of, yeah, we need to do something, but I'm not sure what it is. Or do you get people who are just, do they resist you when you sit down and go, yeah, we're really going to make some change now? What is that experience like for you?
Yeah, I mean, the number one driver of change is pain,
Yeah.
unfortunately, right?
Yep,
Is
true.
you get to a point of pain where you say, I am done with this pain and I'm going to do something about it. When I'm trying, and so that's usually it, Bill, is somebody
Yeah.
has so much pain that they're like, do it, let's do anything. And I'll help them figure out what they need to do, and then I'll kick them in the ass and make them do it. But when somebody's in the process, there's this concept in EOS. It's just a basic concept in general that, if you're going to grow, and this can be for a company, it could be for an individual, you're going to go through these plateau moments where the way you've operated breaks.
Yeah.
Right. And what my job is as the coach is to get them to recognize they're at that plateau and something needs to change. Even when we're in the journey, year 1, year 2, even at the 2-year mark where they have this framework, they'll hit another plateau. What is it? Why are we stuck? Right? Getting them to recognize that sooner is a core principle, because a lot of companies and a lot of leaders will just hit this plateau and be there for 10 years and just zombie. They like become a zombie in the business where they just continue doing the same shit, and they forget, like they almost gaslight themselves that it's normal when it's like, it is not normal. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So my job is to say, you're at the ceiling. Like, what are we going to do about it? What's the change that we have to make? Do we have to change a process? Do we have to hire a person? Right? Do we have to let go of a person? Right? What is causing this ceiling? Reinvent yourself and let's keep growing. So that is at the core, at the fundamental level, that is my job. It's time to change. What is that change? Let's go do it.
Scary. Can be scary, as a matter of fact.
Can be.
Can be enormously rewarding, can be phenomenally good, but it almost always is scary. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. But what I will say is, and in my experience, once you start, like, growth is on the other side of change. And so if people can have that perspective of, yes, this change is scary, but the other side is growth, it's easier to go into it.
Great stuff. Dan, thank you again. Appreciate it. Taylor, how do we get, well, actually, Dan, if people want to get in touch with you, does Taylor have your information so we can have it in the show notes and they can reference it, or how do you prefer people reach out to you?
Yeah, Taylor's got my information, text, email, call, whatever it is. Taylor's got it. Hit me anytime.
We'll include links to Dan's LinkedIn and his website. Those will all be in the show notes.
Beautiful. And Taylor, if people want to give you a call, maybe after having listened to this, thinking you're somebody they'd like to have a conversation with, how can they reach out to you?
The links will be in the show notes, but if you're someone who is experiencing that pain that Dan was just talking about, if your business is growing, if your life is evolving, and you're not sure if your financial strategy is evolving with it, We've got a quiz, a 3-minute quiz you can take. It's called our Strategic Wealth Scorecard. That link's right in the show notes. And that's going to give you immediate feedback of, hey, here's an area you might want to look at. Here's some immediate feedback about how you might want to fix it. And then from there, you can certainly schedule a call. And again, just like Dan and all the EOS folks out there, I'm always happy to talk. No cost, no charge, no commitment. Happy to give you a quick assessment of where I see the issues and opportunities.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I think, don't realize that it's like, look, the initial conversation with a lot of people who can really be helpful is free. It costs you nothing to find out. So if you're out there and you're listening to the podcast and you're thinking, maybe do it, just do it. And it doesn't commit you to anything except having that initial conversation. So reach out and do that. The other thing you can do that's free, there's nothing. You don't even have to talk to people. Just hit the follow button and become a subscriber to the podcast. That way, every time Taylor drops a new edition, you'll be notified and you can give it a listen and keep current with what Taylor is talking about these days. And do me a favor, if you like this podcast, tell people about it, will you please? Word of mouth promotion is a extremely useful tool, and we would very much appreciate it. So until next time, I'm Bill Tucker. On behalf of Taylor and everybody at the Pleasant Street Podcast, thank you for taking the time to listen today. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for joining us on the Pleasant Street Pod. Be sure to follow the show so you never miss a new episode. To learn more, visit pleasantstreetwealth.com or give us a call at 518-363-9363. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect those of Pleasant Street Wealth Advisors, LLC or Farther Finance Advisors, LLC. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered professional investing advice. Always consult your financial advisor or another qualified provider with questions about your investment planning.